Desde mi juventud como lideresa ambiental, he abogado por el liderazgo y la resolución de conflicto. Colombia, mi país, tiene una historia marcada por la violencia. Una violencia que tiene múltiples orígenes y múltiples manifestaciones. Yo llegué a la política sin haberlo querido, nunca. Sin haber soñado en ello, porque vengo de un pueblo marginado. Mi familia nunca estuvo en los círculos de política, ni tuvo las ambiciones de poder. Pero mis abuelas y mi mamá sí me enseñaron a cuidar la vida. Mi comunidad me inculcó la necesidad de resistir a la violencia, tanto armada como estructural. Porque la resistencia era la única posibilidad de sobrevivencia, teniendo en cuenta que el derecho a la vida no está garantizado en muchos territorios de nuestro país. Desde que llegué a la vicepresidencia, he descubierto que aunque desde el gobierno queramos la garantía de los derechos humanos, no basta con querer proteger la vida. La voluntad siempre ha sido necesaria y lastimosamente a muchos gobiernos anteriores le faltó esa voluntad. Pero no basta con poner los derechos humanos de todos y todas como una prioridad. La violencia tiene unas causas estructurales y profundas. Tiene unas raíces en el violento proceso de colonización, de la esclavitud y la institución de la desigualdad, en el modelo de desarrollo económico que se nos ha impuesto, en un modelo que defienden unos privilegios y un modo de acumulación de la riqueza sobre la desposesión de los cuerpos y territorios. De igual manera, la industrialización y el extractivismo no solo ha promovido, sino que ha llegado a financiar la violencia. A mi comunidad y a mí nos amenazaron por oponernos a grandes empresas extractivistas en nuestro país, así como han asesinado y amenazado a cientos de líderes y lideresas por defender el territorio como un espacio de vida. Querían dejarnos sin ese espacio de vida. Esto me llevó a decir que defender los derechos humanos sin pensar en la justicia climática y en un nuevo modo de relacionamiento con la naturaleza es un sinsentido. Por otro lado, la lucha contra las drogas, que se ha llegado a justificar desde la perspectiva de los derechos humanos, es una guerra desigual que castiga a los eslabones más débiles, mientras que permite que los eslabones fuertes sigan en impunidad. La ilegalidad alimenta el narcotráfico y el narcotráfico es el combustible de la violencia que azota a mi país y a toda la región de América Latina. Y este enfoque global, esta perspectiva colonial de los derechos humanos impide que avancemos en la defensa de la vida. Asimismo, la industria armamentista juega un papel en la promoción de la violencia y su influencia económica es un obstáculo para profundizar la defensa de los derechos humanos en el mundo. Tenemos industrias con mucho poder que están defendiendo un modelo que en muchos aspectos se contrapone a la defensa de los derechos humanos. Un modelo que va en contra de la vida, que no es capaz de poner la vida en el centro. Un modelo que privilegia unas vidas sobre otras. Tenemos el reto de pensar la paz y la seguridad del futuro, porque hoy en día el paradigma de los derechos humanos resulta insuficiente. No somos capaces, como Estados miembros, de detener el genocidio, de detener el desplazamiento forzado. No somos capaces de detener el hambre. En ese sentido, quisiera invitar a quienes me acompañan en este panel a repensar los derechos humanos desde y para poner la vida en el centro de todos y todas, donde la humanidad y sobre todo el planeta tenga posibilidades de existencia. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas todas.
Thank you. Next, now I'm just going to give the floor to the moderator of the next panel. That's the Human Rights and Peace and Security. She's the UN Under-Secretary General for the Department of Global Communications, Melissa Fleming. Thank you very much. She's going to be presenting the structure of the discussion, set the ground rules, and introduce the panelists. Thank you very much, Madam Under-Secretary General.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you for this amazing scene setting this morning. I'm really honored for this opportunity to moderate the high-level panel on the future of human rights, peace and security. Ladies and gentlemen, my job at the United Nations is to communicate about the state of the world, and it is a world that is in crisis. Authoritarianism is on the march and democracy is in peril. The climate emergency rages unchecked and humanitarian needs and forced displacement stand at record highs. And a quarter of the world's population, a quarter, now lives in areas of war and conflict. This has devastating impacts on millions of lives and livelihoods, and all too often, widespread and systemic human rights violations precede the outbreak of these conflicts. Injustice, discrimination, oppression, extreme inequalities, and a lack of accountability are among the factors that make violence more likely. And addressing these root causes can prevent escalation, and if conflict breaks out, respect for human rights can diminish the horror and foster trust as a step towards resolution and peace. So let's delve into this in today's round table and this mutually reinforcing relationship between human rights, peace, and security. Let's shed light on the intricate connections between these pillars and their profound impact on the world. This discussion will take place in 3 segments. First, with our distinguished panel here, which I am pleased to see is perfectly balanced between men and women. And each panelist will answer one of more of the guiding questions, drawing from lessons of the past and the present, but also we've asked them to focus on forward-looking approaches. Our second segment will feature respondents from the audience who will be reacting to statements made by the panelists, and time allowed, we will have a third segment which will include reactions from the panelists again. So without further ado, let's embark on the exploration of this important topic, and our first panelist is His Excellency, President Andrzej Duda of Poland. And just one notable human rights fact: Poland provides protection and support to over 950,000 refugees from Ukraine who fled from the war raging across your southeast border. Mr. President, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Undersecretary, Excellencies, Presidents, distinguished guests, distinguished representatives of the member countries, and distinguished guests. Bardzo dziękuję za możliwość uczestnictwa w tym okrągłym stole. Proszę Państwa, od czasu przyjęcia powszechnej deklaracji praw człowieka na przestrzeni tego długiego czasu, tych dziesięcioleci, pojawiło się wiele wyzwań, ale ostatni czas, dokładnie ostatnich kilka lat, wydaje się, że jest takim momentem kolejnego spiętrzenia ważnych i niebezpiecznych wydarzeń, które nie tylko, że skupiają uwagę nas wszystkich, ale także i w ogromnym stopniu wpływają na kwestie przestrzegania i postrzegania przestrzegania praw człowieka w przestrzeni międzynarodowej. Pierwszy, znany nam wszystkim znakomicie, to pandemia COVID-19, z którą zetknęliśmy się i która dotknęła praktycznie wszystkie nasze kraje, miała charakter ogólnoświatowy i wiemy znakomicie, jak wiele dyskusji dotyczących przestrzegania praw człowieka i praw obywatelskich wywołała sama pandemia jako taka, jak i decyzje podejmowane przez nasze rządy, jak i organizacje międzynarodowe. Drugi problem bardzo poważny, zwłaszcza dla nas w Europie, ale nie tylko, to kwestia tego, co stało się 24 lutego 2022 roku, a mianowicie rosyjska agresja na Ukrainę i nie tylko cierpienie, jakie Rosja w ten sposób wywołała atakiem przeciwko społeczeństwu, narodowi ukraińskiemu, bombardowaniem cywilnych osiedli, miejscowości, miast, tysiącami zabitych zwykłych obywateli, ale także i tym, co wywołała ta wojna w przestrzeni ogólnoświatowej, kryzysem humanitarnym, kryzysem żywnościowym, kryzysem energetycznym, tym wszystkim, co dotknęło nas, właściwie niezależnie od tego, w której części świata mieszkamy, bo nawet jeżeli jakieś państwo było odporne na kryzys żywnościowy, bo nie było wielkim beneficjentem dostaw choćby zboża czy oleju słonecznikowego z Ukrainy, to dotknęły je kwestia nagłego wzrostu cen energii i tego wszystkiego, co uderzyło w kieszenie praktycznie każdego zwykłego mieszkańca ziemi. To także jest kwestia przestrzegania praw człowieka. Ale chociaż większość krajów zdaje sobie sprawę, że te wszystkie wydarzenia mają miejsce, a podobne pewnie będą miały miejsce w przyszłości, to mimo wszystko nie wolno nam tracić z pola widzenia zagadnienia właśnie przestrzegania praw człowieka, albowiem piecza nad tym, aby prawa człowieka były przestrzegane, jest nieustannym obowiązkiem nas wszystkich. Dzisiejsza rocznica zbiega się także z 75. rocznicą przyjęcia konwencji o zapobieganiu i karaniu zbrodni ludobójstwa. Ja przypomnę z niejaką dumą jako Polak, że na czele wysiłków na rzecz jej opracowania stał Polak żydowskiego pochodzenia, wybitny prawnik polski Rafał Lemkin, autor między innymi terminu ludobójstwo, genocide. Bezkarność i brak odpowiedzialności nigdy nie powinny się stawać prawidłami w stosunkach międzynarodowych. To jest generalna zasada, która przyświecała przyjmowaniu tych wszystkich kolejnych dokumentów i która także i nam dzisiaj musi przyświecać. Tym istotnym elementem zapobiegania popełnianiu zbrodni międzynarodowych jest nieuchronność pociągania do odpowiedzialności winnych. Mówiłem już przed momentem, sygnalizowałem tą kwestię podczas naszej poprzedniej dyskusji. W tym kontekście koniecznie trzeba zwrócić uwagę na rolę komisji śledczych i innych specjalnych procedur ustanawianych tutaj w Genewie przez Radę Praw Człowieka. Ubiegły rok, jak wspomniałem przed momentem, rozpoczął się pod znakiem brutalnej i niczym nieusprawiedliwionej rosyjskiej agresji na Ukrainę, która całkowicie podeptała przyświecające nam wspólne wartości, które wyznawane są przez społeczność międzynarodową. Działania Rosji, bombardowania, jak wspomniałem, co widzieliśmy wszyscy, miast i osiedli na Ukrainie są spektakularne i absolutnie nieludzkie. Nie możemy pozwolić na takie lekceważenie życia niewinnych ludzi, na łamanie podstawowych praw człowieka, prawa do życia, prawa do wolności, do bezpieczeństwa. Wiele naruszeń udokumentowanych między innymi przez Międzynarodową Niezależną Komisję Śledczą na Ukrainie stanowi absolutnie bez wątpienia zbrodnie wojenne, a niektóre z nich z całą pewnością mogą być kwalifikowane także jako zbrodnie przeciwko ludzkości. Dlatego też musimy jako społeczność międzynarodowa zrobić wszystko, by ci, którzy dopuszczają się łamania praw człowieka, by ci, którzy dopuszczają się zbrodni przeciwko ludzkości, łamią normy prawa międzynarodowego, zostali osądzeni. Wolny i demokratyczny świat nie może spać spokojnie, dopóki sprawiedliwość i uczciwość nie zwycięży. Szanowni Państwo, w tym kontekście koniecznie trzeba zwrócić również i uwagę na sytuację, która ma miejsce obecnie na Białorusi. Według najnowszych danych jest tam dzisiaj około 5000 więźniów politycznych. Jest wśród nich także Polak z pochodzenia, obywatel Białorusi, ale Polak z pochodzenia, polsko-białoruski dziennikarz skazany na 8 lat więzienia, a pod koniec listopada zatrzymanych zostało również 2 polskich księży, Henryk Okołotowicz i Wiaczesław Pialiniak. W sprawie obywateli polskich przetrzymywanych na Białorusi używamy wszelkich środków dyplomatycznych, aby ich uwolnić. Niestety, jak do tej pory, od długiego czasu jest to całkowicie bezskuteczne. Ci, jak i wielu innych, zostali skazani na podstawie fałszywych dowodów podczas zainscenizowanych procesów, których wynik jest znany jeszcze przed ich rozpoczęciem. My w Polsce mamy doświadczenie, także i moje pokolenie, choć stosunkowo młode, bo głównie to jest doświadczenie pokolenia moich rodziców z czasów, kiedy znajdowaliśmy się za żelazną kurtyną w sowieckiej strefie wpływów, kiedy nie było w Polsce demokracji. Znamy takie procesy polityczne, gdzie składy sędziowskie skazywały ludzi według z góry podyktowanych przez partię komunistyczną wskazań, wbrew wszelkim regułom, wbrew wszelkim prawom człowieka, wbrew wszelkim regułom demokratycznym. Dzisiaj to dzieje się na Białorusi, dzisiaj to dzieje się także wobec ludzi, którzy mają polskie korzenie. Społeczność międzynarodowa zdecydowanie powinna się temu sprzeciwiać i piętnować tego typu karygodne działania. To niewiarygodne, że dzieje się to tak blisko granicy NATO, że dzieje się to tak blisko granicy Unii Europejskiej, że nadal w kraju, który jest bezpośrednio za naszymi granicami, istnieją w XXI wieku izby tortur i nie ma kontaktu z ludźmi, którzy są osadzeni w więzieniu, bo tak jest dzisiaj w przypadku Andrzeja Poczobuta. Od długiego czasu nawet jego najbliżsi nie mogą się z nim skontaktować i tak naprawdę nie wiemy, jaki jest w tej chwili jego los. Wiemy tylko, że był chory jeszcze wtedy, kiedy był z nim kontakt, ale od kilku miesięcy tego kontaktu zupełnie nie ma i dziś nie wiemy tak naprawdę, czy żyje, czy też nie. Liczymy na to, że tak i liczymy na to, że uda się go uwolnić. W ciągu ostatnich kilku lat byliśmy także świadkami szeregu ataków terrorystycznych, także i w ostatnim czasie. Ten ostatni, przeprowadzony 7 października przez Hamas przeciwko Izraelowi, przeciwko izraelskiej ludności cywilnej, skutkował śmiercią ponad 1000 osób. Takie ataki zawsze muszą spotykać się ze zdecydowanym sprzeciwem ze strony społeczności międzynarodowej. To samo dotyczy przetrzymywania zakładników. Publikowane w internecie filmy z egzekucji porwanych osób były wyrazem największego okrucieństwa i brutalności. Musimy pamiętać o tym, że życie ludzkie nigdy nie może być kartą przetargową w jakimkolwiek konflikcie. O ile dla nas jest oczywiste i popieramy prawo Izraela, tak jak i każdego innego państwa do samoobrony, ale Polska opowiada się za rozwiązaniem konfliktu na zasadzie dwupaństwowej. Chciałbym jednocześnie mocno zaznaczyć, że obie dzisiaj walczące strony tam na Bliskim Wschodzie muszą pamiętać, że żadne działania wojskowe nie mogą być wymierzone w ludność cywilną i nie mogą łamać jej praw. Nie może być tak, że bombardowane są osiedla cywilne, czy to po jednej, czy po drugiej stronie granicy, czy dopuszcza się tego jedna, czy druga strona konfliktu. My jako społeczność międzynarodowa nigdy nie możemy się z tym zgodzić i nigdy nie możemy się z tym pogodzić i zawsze naszym obowiązkiem jest piętnowanie tego. Mam nadzieję, że wkrótce zostanie osiągnięte tam zawieszenie broni i że będzie ono trwałe. Szanowni Państwo, mój kraj, Polska, niejednokrotnie doświadczony był na przestrzeni stuleci historii przez akty agresji i zbrodni wojennych ze strony innych krajów. Polska zawsze i niezmiennie będzie stać po stronie prawa i po stronie ofiar przemocy. Wyrazem naszej odpowiedzialności za międzynarodowy pokój i bezpieczeństwo i prawa człowieka było aktywne uczestnictwo Polski w Radzie Bezpieczeństwa ONZ w latach 2018-2019, którego centralnym elementem była troska o los najbardziej bezbronnych w konfliktach zbrojnych, przywracając poszanowanie prawa międzynarodowego i promowanie praw człowieka. Wspieramy również nowe inicjatywy sekretarza generalnego ONZ, w tym szczyt na rzecz przyszłości oraz agendę dla pokoju, które pokazują, jak możemy wykorzystać potencjał praw człowieka na rzecz budowania pokoju i bezpieczeństwa. Musimy połączyć nasze wysiłki i zadbać o to, aby nikt nie pozostał bezkarny za łamanie najbardziej podstawowych praw człowieka. Nigdy nie możemy ustawać w walce o to, by prawa człowieka były przestrzegane. Także poprzez z jednej strony prewencyjną ich ochronę, ale z drugiej strony poprzez stanowcze ściganie i karanie winnych ich naruszania. Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you, Excellency, for this perspective from Poland. And I would now like to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Riyad Al-Malki, Minister for Foreign Affairs of the State of Palestine. As we just heard from the President of Poland, the situation in his region is on everyone's mind after the horrific attacks and hostage-taking by Hamas on the 7th of October, followed by the relentless Israeli bombardment and siege of Gaza. And as the UN Secretary-General Guterres has warned, the situation in Gaza is fast deteriorating into a catastrophe with potentially irreversible implications for Palestinians as a whole and for peace and security in the region. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We are here today to mark the 75th year since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to look 25 years ahead and to discuss recommendations on promoting peace through human rights lens. There are many dark ironies in our discussions today, not the least of which is that I represent a people whose fundamental rights to life, to dignity and to self-determination, among many others, have been denied for 75 years. As we speak, at least 1 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, half of them children, are starving, not because of a natural disaster or because of lack of generous assistance waiting at the border. No, they are starving because of Israel's deliberate use of starvation as a weapon of war against the people it occupied. Rather than condemning this atrocious crime, states have accommodated it and accepted Israel's criminal terms for how much food, for how much water, for how much fuel and medicine can enter Gaza and to whom this essential aid can be supplied. Rather than insisting on respecting the Palestinian people's basic right to eat and drink water, we are living through this dystopian reality that excludes Palestinians from the most basic rights afforded to all human beings. I understand the importance and value of this discussion in theory, but it is difficult for me as a Palestinian, as a human, to comprehend it during this dark hour of utter international failure towards the most basic rights of an entire people, my people. Events have unfortunately made such a discussion moot. Because if human rights are trampled in so pervasively, so audaciously, so publicly, and so arrogantly today, and if such objectionable behavior is excused, supported, and protected, how can we sit here in all seriousness and accept that the international system can survive 25 years down the line? The answer is, it simply cannot. When human rights are not universal, this declaration and all the progress we thought we achieved globally over the decades become irrelevant and unconvincing. When schools, markets, hospitals, and open fields turn into mass graves in Gaza, when more than 8,000 children are slaughtered and thousands more are injured and made orphans, and when one single state can torpedo the will of the world to stop these massacres, how can we dare say that human rights are universal? Rather than pontificating about our rules-based international system and the universal values of human rights, we must have the courage to say that our system is failing, and failing miserably. This system is broken, and we have a historic responsibility to fix it, or else resign to being complicit in its catastrophic demise and humanity devolving into a new normal of brutality, unchecked powers, and savagery. We must admit that our system has tolerated the selective application of the responsibility to respect human rights and international humanitarian law for far too long, and at the cost of far too many innocent lives. The structure of the system that allows a few states to leverage their enormous power over humanity must change, because it has also allowed for far too long the exceptional treatment of rugged states like Israel as states above international law and beyond the reach of accountability. This is intolerable and unacceptable because it undermines the values we as states uphold and the accomplishments each of us achieves at the national level. The universality of human rights must mean that our national and foreign policies align, that we treat all human life with respect and dignity regardless of color, of nationality, of gender or creed, period. Looking forward, we must commit to the principle that human rights cannot be a privilege of a select group. as they are today. We must do that in action, not hollow statements and carefully crafted eloquence that entrench injustices and produce no change. For us to look at hungry, terrified, and displaced Palestinian children in Gaza in the eye, we have to commit to doing things differently. To promise them a life where there is no veto on his or her right to live and to enjoy freedom, safety, and dignity. To pledge that they would never again be dehumanized and called human animals or children of darkness, or excluded from humanity so that they could be killed, maimed, or orphaned in their thousands, as is happening today. And we must make good on that promise today. After 75 years of the Palestinian Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe, and as Israel commits another Nakba before our eyes today, the need for global solidarity and action has never been greater. The Palestinian people must enjoy their fundamental rights to life, to justice, to dignity, and to self-determination. They must be freed from the monstrosities committed against them to maintain an illegal regime of colonial control, domination, and persecution by way of apartheid. This abomination must end. So, what do we do? How do we break free from this dark hour of agony and immeasurable suffering? The answer is simple. We listen to the roaring cries for peace and human rights that have filled the streets of cities worldwide. We heed their calls that never again means never again for everybody. We not only call for a ceasefire, we actively work to achieve it. We not only call for respect for human rights and international law, we sanction Israel for violating these international obligations without hesitation. In short, we reject and end Israeli exceptionalism. As a proud state party to 7 UN human rights treaties and an additional 7 protocols, Palestine remains committed to these international standards. We believe they are not mere words, and we know that we are not alone in that. But as a family of nations, we must do better, much better, to uphold the universality of these values and standards so that they survive the indignities and double standards we are witnessing now in Gaza. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I now invite Her Excellency, Ms. Retno Lestari Priyansari Marsudi, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Indonesia. Indonesia supports peace and security around the world by providing over 2,700 officers to UN peacekeeping missions, just as one small fact that I would like to introduce you with. The floor is yours, Your Excellency.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And to start with, of course, happy 75th anniversary of UDHR. Colleagues, I would like to pick up what my brother Riyad just mentioned. It is very sad that at the time when we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we remain seeing the gross violation of human rights in Palestine and Gaza. Killing civilians, destruction of hospitals, places of worship and refugee camps, and depriving Palestinians of their basic rights should never be justified as self-defense. These are simply breaches of international humanitarian law. These unprecedented horrors are a major regress and even an attack on global human rights agenda. Therefore, colleagues, I would like to propose 3 important points for the global community to work on, especially related to Palestine issue. First, we need to renew our collective commitment to human rights agenda. Commitment to be human rights defenders means we should not be mute to defend justice and humanity. And I deeply regret that the UNSC's continued failure to adopt a resolution for a humanitarian ceasefire. It represents a failure of an outdated multilateral system. Therefore, commitment to human rights should be renewed, and we have to employ resources and influence to assist Palestinians to regain their dignity. Second, reject double standard on human rights agenda. Double standard is the biggest problem on the implementation of human rights. Those who were lecturing us about human rights now allowing the occupying power to breach all human rights standards. Implementation of human rights should not be selective or only when the mighty sees fit. What happened in Gaza is a grave, systematic, and widespread violation of human rights, and therefore a thorough investigation on the ground should be undertaken. And third, end the cycle of human rights violation through peace process. Colleagues, 75 years ago, we agreed that human rights, peace and security are interdependent, interrelated and mutually reinforcing. The root cause of the Palestinian question should be addressed. A genuine peace process must be restarted toward a two-state solution. And that is what Indonesia, the OIC countries, and many countries have been urging all countries, the P5 in particular. So, colleagues, to conclude, the global community will never achieve universalization of human rights agenda if we do not address the plight of the Palestinian people. And we must act in solidarity, and we must act now. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And now I invite Ms. Beatrice Finn, Director of the NGO Lex International, which is working to drive positive change through international law. Formerly, Ms. Finn was Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. Ms. Finn, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Melissa. And thank you so much to the High Commissioner and the Human Rights 75 team for having me here. I know that civil society is a very central part of the human rights conversations, but we're not always so central in the peace and security conversation, so it's really, really great to be here. As many of the other speakers, of course, have talked about, things feel extremely bleak at the moment for human rights and for peace and security. And we're all watching this worsening of the geopolitical situation with blatant disregard of international law. And we're seeing a really worrying trend of disregarding human rights to protect this idea of security. And that's something that we see come in from civil society coming back quite often. There's a very deep-held view from some that somehow security trumps human rights. Often when states feel insecure, threatened, scared, human rights and humanitarian principles are the first thing that gets abandoned. It happens in all places, autocracies, but also in democracies and everything in between. When national security is suddenly at stake, free speech, right of individuals, right of minorities, the rights to organize, etc., are not upheld. And we're seeing a very worrying trend, of course, also that attacks on civil society, human rights violation, suppression of free speech is being pursued because we're all really, really scared. We're scared of the worsening tensions in the world. We're scared of the impact of climate change that is coming. We're scared of a really fast-changing world. But what we really do know is that human rights, democracy, an active civil society actually is the recipe for more security, for more peace. And by fully committing to human rights, we can actually create a more peaceful, just and secure world. And I'm not saying that just as some magic fix, that by implementing human rights, suddenly everything will be peaceful. We have to do it pragmatically. We have to do practically, concrete work to improve the conditions that we have for peace and security. And just an example, that is really what happened with the work on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Nuclear weapons is really at the core of these sort of so-called hard security issues. And in fact, it's one of the root causes of a really unjust world order, where some countries argue that they have more rights than others, that gives some countries the sense of impunity to commit violations of international law, invade countries and commit war crimes. And how we used human rights on this issue was really to, instead of focusing on the terms around nuclear weapons like strategic stability and this theory of nuclear deterrence, we looked at a human-centric approach. What would happen to people if these weapons were used on the ground, in reality? And that really shifted the whole conversation. It mobilized all states of the United Nations, international organizations, civil society, by centering this sort of traditional state-centric issue around human rights, individual rights, bringing in testimonies, voices from impacted communities. We shifted the discourse and achieved an international ban on nuclear weapons under international law. And just 2 weeks ago in New York, we held the second meeting of states parties to this treaty. And it was remarkable to see the stark difference of who gets to speak on an issue like nuclear weapons. We had impacted communities from nuclear test sites. We had countries from all parts of the world. We had youth. We had such a diverse community. And those kind of processes are better. They become better, solid solutions to our problems. And the TPNW is not the first example of how to do this, and it certainly won't be the last. We know we can achieve better peace agreements, better solutions when we take human rights perspective to the issues, and when we implement human rights obligations and bring in diverse voices. So, as we're sitting here today, I wanted to bring also a few recommendations that I would like for people to listen to take away from here. I mean, first also to all states here in the room, do not sacrifice human rights for so-called security. Because without human rights, we really don't have any security and safety for people. Do not apply the rules to some but not to others. We need to be consistent. I would also really encourage you to work more with civil society. We have some countries that speak very well about civil society in areas of women's rights or human rights, but when it comes to weapons issues, security issues, we're not so popular. But we also have countries that are very good friends and allies to us in weapons issues, but when it comes to the human rights issue, we're not exactly looking eye to eye. So work with us consistently across the border. We don't always agree. We're pretty annoying at times, but that is really our job. Countries with active, diverse, and strong civil society are safer, more resilient, and more peaceful. And then just a final recommendation for everyone who work on these issues of human rights, peace, and security right now. It is hard. It feels really, really difficult, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who questions what the point of all of this is when we see so much suffering in the world right now. And I would just like to encourage everyone to hold on to humanity, to our treaties, to our laws, to the humanitarian principles, and do everything we can to continue this work because it's so sorely needed. So thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice. And now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Emile Prophet-Milsey, the Minister of Justice and Public Security of Haiti. And priorities in Haiti include supporting security, the rule of law, democratic institutions, as well as economic and social stability. So we'd love to hear from you. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Excellences, Mesdames, Messieurs les chefs d'État, de gouvernement, distingués délégués. La Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme en 1948 a été un tournant pour l'humanité. Les populations n'y étaient pas remises des deux guerres successives qu'il avait laissées exsangues et dans une forme d'incompréhension face à la violence qui s'était déchaînée en l'espace de 20 ans. J'aimerais remercier le président Macky Sall d'avoir dit dans cette salle aujourd'hui, plutôt deux fois qu'une, que la plupart des pays, beaucoup des pays qui ont signé en 1948 la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme étaient à l'époque des puissances coloniales. Il faut comprendre la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme d'abord comme un refus de nouveaux conflits et la volonté d'exprimer, de clarifier et de se mettre d'accord sur un certain nombre de points, de dire une fois pour toutes que l'humanité est une, qu'elle transcende les questions de religion, de race, de sexe. Il fallait proclamer le droit de chacun d'avoir accès à l'éducation, à la santé, à la sécurité, de pouvoir manger à sa faim et de pouvoir vivre où il voulait sans être inquiété. Depuis 1948, chaque article de la Déclaration des droits de l'homme est à la fois un défi et une promesse. Elle représente les aspirations des individus, une boussole pour les démocraties et interroge notre humanité. Comment rendre le monde meilleur si on ne l'idéalise pas ? Le but ultime de nos vies n'est-il pas d'atteindre un idéal? Il fallait un idéal pour l'humanité et c'est ce que fut et demeure la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme. Nous sommes à bon droit aujourd'hui de nous interroger sur l'avenir des droits humains, la paix et la sécurité au regard de ce qui se passe dans le monde. Les réfugiés, les personnes déplacées dans leur propre pays, les inégalités diverses, les guerres, la violence des médias sociaux, la circulation des armes et le désespoir des pauvres qui, mis à mal par les dictatures, le capitalisme sauvage, les changements climatiques, se retrouvent complètement perdus. Mais justement, la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme nous invite à ne pas désespérer. Nous ne pouvons qu'être à la fois surpris et ravis de constater qu'il n'y a pas une virgule à modifier dans cette déclaration. Nous devons prendre nos responsabilités. Sans une recherche constante de la paix, il n'y a pas d'avenir pour l'humanité. Sans le respect des droits civils et politiques, il n'y a pas d'avenir pour les démocraties. Sans le respect des droits humains, il n'y a pas d'avenir tout court. La sécurité et la paix sont et seront les corollaires du respect des droits humains. Il n'y a pas de place pour une nation, un individu. S'il n'y a pas de place pour une nation ou un individu, il n'y aura de place pour personne. Les conflits font reculer l'humanité. La République d'Haïti n'est pas peu fière d'avoir contribué de manière significative à l'adoption et à l'élaboration du texte de la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme. Cette contribution est en droite ligne avec le pays qui l'est et demeure attaché aux idéaux qui ont prévalu à sa naissance. Haïti, comme l'a écrit si bien le poète Aimé Césaire, est le pays où la négritude se mit debout pour la première fois et dit qu'elle croyait en son humanité. La République d'Haïti aujourd'hui est en difficulté. Elle a besoin de créer les conditions pour le respect intégral des droits de ses citoyens mis à mal par des gangs armés. La société fait face à une grande violence qui est d'abord le fait que les droits des uns et des autres ne sont pas respectés, n'ont pas été respectés. J'affirme donc que le non-respect des droits de l'homme met en péril la sécurité, la paix, donc l'avenir. Chacun des combats que nous menons dans nos pays respectifs doit être en faveur des droits humains dans tous les sens du terme. Le gouvernement de la République d'Haïti est attaché à la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme et ne reniera jamais ses principes, d'où son combat incessant pour rétablir la paix et la sécurité et faire des élections. Les droits humains, c'est l'avenir. Dans notre monde en pleine ébullition, le respect des droits de l'homme est souvent remis en question, soit considéré comme secondaire par rapport à certaines causes, alors qu'il constitue un facteur important pouvant contribuer au maintien de la paix et de la sécurité. Beaucoup de conflits actuels sont le résultat du non-respect des droits humains ou de leur occultation, particulièrement les droits économiques et sociaux et les droits civils et politiques. Ces conflits pourraient être évités si certains pays prenaient les mesures appropriées pour le respect des droits économiques et sociaux, des droits civils et politiques en tant que droits fondamentaux. Lorsque des citoyens ne sont pas en mesure de jouir de leurs droits économiques et sociaux, le risque de recours à la violence augmente. Les pays doivent combattre les discriminations, viser une société plus égalitaire où les citoyens peuvent avoir accès aux besoins de base, à savoir les soins de santé, l'éducation, l'alimentation, le travail décent, le logement. Ils doivent aussi s'adonner à résorber le chômage par la promotion et la facilitation des investissements. En Haïti, la société est très inégalitaire. La majorité des citoyens fait face à des difficultés économiques, n'a pas accès aux services publics de base et cette situation contribue à la grande violence à laquelle fait face la société. Le respect des droits de l'homme est la première condition de la paix et la garantie d'une société démocratique. Les conflits peuvent être évités en priorisant le respect des droits civils et politiques. Ceci peut se réaliser à travers des mécanismes permanents permettant aux populations de participer de manière égale au processus politique. Le choix des dirigeants doit se faire à travers des élections régulières et démocratiques. Les institutions, notamment celles concernées par les élections, doivent être fortes de manière à faire respecter les règles établies. Haïti est ce pays qui, en 1948, a énormément contribué pour que nous soyons ici aujourd'hui. Et nous sommes fiers d'avoir été ce pays-là, d'avoir apporté cette contribution-là. Et Haïti reste aujourd'hui, malgré les accidents de l'histoire, malgré tous les problèmes qu'il a pu avoir ces dernières décennies et peut-être depuis toujours, parce qu'après l'indépendance, Haïti a fait face à beaucoup de résistance. Aujourd'hui, les droits de l'homme doivent devenir une réalité et c'est notre devoir de soutenir chaque pays. Dans la première constitution d'Haïti, dans la première constitution, il est dit que tous ceux qui s'estiment être en danger, tous ceux qui cherchent la liberté peuvent venir en Haïti. Nous gardons cette générosité et aujourd'hui, il faut regarder le monde peut-être avec d'autres yeux et se dire que la liberté est possible, que cette déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme en 1948 semble certains jours être une utopie, mais il faut que nous résistions et il faut que nous nous attelions tous à réaliser les objectifs que cette déclaration s'est fixée et continue de se fixer encore. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And I'd now like to give the floor, last but not least, to Tant Bint U, who is a distinguished visiting scholar at the University of Cambridge. And among other steps in his impressive career, Dr. Mint U is a former UN colleague, having served in Cambodia, the former Yugoslavia, and at UN headquarters in New York. And his grandfather was U Thant, the UN Secretary General from 1961 to 1971. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Melissa. I think when we imagine the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 75 years ago, we tend to place it within the story of the long 20th century, of World War I, World War II, then the Cold War, then the post-Cold War era, and whatever era it is that we're living in today. But I think for much of the world, the majority of the world in many ways, the story of the 20th century is a story of empire and post-empire. And then the way in which dozens of new nations, dozens of new states, especially in Africa and in Asia, inserted themselves into the project of the big powers and made the UN their own, and embraced the Charter, embraced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then in Geneva and in New York, under exciting new leadership, drove and crafted new agendas on peace, on disarmament, on anti-racism, on anti-apartheid, on decolonization, on development, and on a fair international economic system. I think stories matter, and at this time when we are under pressure, the international system, as perhaps never before, I think it's important also to think of alternative ways in which to place our commitment to human rights within the broader history of the world so that we have a better understanding of the past, but also perhaps be able to imagine the future in different ways as well. I want to make a few remarks on the relationship between economic rights in particular and peace and security and peace building. And here I'm not thinking so much about countries which have been invaded, situations of interstate war, situations of occupation. I'm thinking more of those places, those countries which have been the site of civil war, violent internal conflict, perhaps for many years, perhaps for many decades, and where the UN has been tasked with a peacemaking or peace-building responsibility. And that is, of course, the situation of hundreds of millions of people around the world today. And I think in these situations, the realization of economic rights, if we're going to be honest with ourselves, is many, many years, if not generations, away. But the question is, what do you do practically, and what do you do initially to begin that move forward? And I think for those of us who are on the outside in those situations, who are trying to help through the international system, I think the first thing that's needed is a much more robust investment in actually understanding the political economies of these countries, understanding the markets that have evolved, that have been created during wartime, understanding how these markets may be linked perhaps to illicit industries, how these markets may be linked to global capital and to global markets as well, and almost certainly tied intimately to local systems of power and patronage. And then to think in this analysis of what are the other sort of influences on that economy at that time, the entire range of issues, not just aid that might be given at that time, but also the whole spectrum of different economic dynamics ranging from sanctions to migration and remittances from migration, for example, to again ties to informal, perhaps illicit industries. Much of this will be invisible, but it's absolutely important as a first step that we understand not just the economics of these countries, but the political economy of these countries if we want to help these first steps towards the realization of economic rights. The second thing I would say in relation to this is that we need to think about what a transitional economy will look like. We can all imagine the perfect economy, perhaps, or the economy in which all economic rights are actually respected and realized. But realistically, over a 2, 3, 4, 5-year period, what is that transitional economy that can be aimed for? What are the changes, the structural changes, perhaps, that can begin in these countries? Where will the sources of growth be? How can some of these markets, which have deep roots in conflict, begin to be changed? And again, we may think about aid, but we need also to think about other aspects, other tools from the fiscal and monetary policies of those states in those countries, to, again, the ways in which these countries tie into global markets, how that should be regulated, how that should be managed. Think about things like foreign exchange controls, think about things like liberalization and the pace of liberalization, if that is the right direction in which to go. I think we need to think about transitional economies that will provide resilience in terms of economic rights, so that if there is a turn in the peace process in a negative direction, that some basic minimum of economic rights, no matter where the broader politics goes, can perhaps be protected. And of course, we need to think about ways in which, even in those first 2, 3, 4 years, it begins to be possible to address fundamental issues of inequality and economic inequality as well. And third and lastly, I think from the outside, what is needed is not a completed formula or strategy that is then dictated to people inside the country in terms of economic reform and in terms of economic change, but the presentation of a menu of options and choices that is understandable not just to the elites of those countries, but to ordinary people as well. Because as we know, in every single country, no one knows how countries actually develop. No one actually knows what is the key ingredient to development. And it's the people of the country who already understand to a large extent the political economy of their own countries who can think through, but they need to think through a better understanding of what is that menu of choices that might be available to them based on experiences elsewhere and based on what the international system and the international community might be able to provide in order to help. And I think at that point, what is essential as something the international system needs to provide is capacity building for negotiation. Because these are states and these are countries that will need to negotiate internationally on the economic front, in terms of borrowing, in terms of finances, in terms of integrating into global markets. And that ability to think through, have that menu, but also be able to negotiate is absolutely key as well. And I think maybe finally, all I would say is that, when we think about these countries, these peace-building challenges, its relationship to economic rights are important in themselves, but a robust, exciting, new, stimulating discussion on initial moves forward on the economic front that will help ordinary people have to be thought not as a technical issue, but as a political issue, and need to be presented not as the domain of economists and technical experts, but a political issue that's for all the people in the country to discuss and debate. And ideally in these countries, it would be discussed and debated through representative democratic institutions, and they will begin to replace old and divisive discussions with new and hopeful discussions on the future of the economy, on the realization of economic rights, as well as peace and security in these countries as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mint Oo, and thank you to all the distinguished panelists who have provided valuable insights from your perspectives into the past, present, and future of human rights and peace and security. And it's now time to move to the second segment of today's roundtable on the future of human rights, peace, and security. We're asking participants to speak only in reaction to the initial interventions by panelists, and I'm afraid the time allocated is only 3 minutes, so thank you very much for sticking to that. And I'd like to first give the floor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Chad, His Excellency Mahamat Saleh Anadev. Thank you. You have the floor, sir.
Merci beaucoup, Madame. On m'a fait comprendre qu'il faut 3 minutes, donc j'essaierai vraiment de me concentrer sur les 3 minutes. D'abord, à l'occasion de cet anniversaire, s'il y a quelque chose autour duquel toute l'humanité et tous les dirigeants sont d'accord, c'est que la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme contient tous les ingrédients nécessaires à la paix et à la sécurité dans le monde. Et j'ai bien aimé l'introduction de Madame Melissa tout à l'heure, qui a commencé par dire qu'il est important de tirer les leçons du passé afin de dessiner le futur. Et donc, pour cela, j'aimerais prendre 2 exemples sur lesquels la communauté internationale n'a malheureusement pas tiré les leçons du passé. Je suis du Tchad et donc je voudrais prendre d'abord le cas de la Libye parce que on m'a dit de parler sur le lien entre les droits de l'homme et les conflits. Vous savez tous qu'en 2011, il y a eu une résolution du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies. Quand le conflit en Libye a éclaté, l'Union africaine, donc tous les Africains, ont élaboré un plan de sortie de crise. Malheureusement, on ne les a pas écoutés. Ce droit ou ce manque de non-écoute aux dirigeants africains a fait que l'OTAN a intervenu et nous sommes arrivés au chaos que nous connaissons. Et aujourd'hui, nous cherchons où est la Libye parce que nous sommes un pays voisin et nous savons ses conséquences sur nous et nous savons ce que coûte l'absence de la Libye. Ça donc. Et à la suite de cela, qu'est-ce qu'il y a eu? Je crois que le président Macky Sall, aussi bien hier qu'aujourd'hui, l'a répété, la résurgence du terrorisme. Là également, c'est un autre manque d'écoute, parce que le terrorisme tel que nous le connaissons aujourd'hui au niveau du Sahel n'est pas d'essence africaine. Il est étranger à l'Afrique. Il vient de l'Orient, il vient de l'Afghanistan, et souvent je pose la question à nos partenaires occidentaux quand ils disent qu'ils ont créé une coalition pour lutter contre Daesh en Irak et en Syrie. Je leur pose une question simple. Où est-ce qu'ils partent les gens qu'ils estiment qu'ils les ont vaincus là-bas? Ils sont vers le Sahel. Ils les envoient en quelque sorte vers le Sahel. Et aujourd'hui, ce qui se passe au Sahel est une menace globale. Il ne faut pas croire que c'est une menace uniquement contre les pays sahéliens. Aujourd'hui, le terrorisme en Europe, la migration clandestine, illégale, c'est la conséquence de cela. Je vois bien l'engouement pour aider l'Ukraine, nous ne sommes pas jaloux pour y faire face, mais dépenser au moins quelque chose pour faire face à ce qui se passe dans le Sahel, parce que ça concerne aussi l'Europe, ça concerne le monde. C'est là où je dis qu'on ne tire pas des leçons de ce que nous vivons. Et la conséquence, c'est quoi? C'est qu'on continue toujours à décider au nom des Africains sans les associer. Le Conseil de sécurité en est un exemple. 70% pratiquement des problèmes qui y discutent concernent l'Afrique. Mais l'Afrique est absente. Et donc c'est pour cela que je suis d'accord avec le secrétaire général des Nations Unies quand il disait en septembre qu'aujourd'hui le choix des réformes du système monétaire ou du système du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies n'est pas seulement un choix entre la réforme et le statu quo, mais il risque d'être un choix entre la réforme ou la rupture totale. Et là, c'est valable également pour les droits de l'homme. Le deuxième point sur lequel je voulais réagir, c'est la question de l'alerte précoce pour éviter les conflits. Et là, je reviens aussi à un autre pays qui est le voisin du Tchad, c'est le cas du Soudan. Nous, au niveau du Tchad, nous étions les premiers depuis janvier-février 2023 à alerter la communauté internationale qu'il risque d'avoir un conflit au Soudan. Personne ne nous a écoutés. À partir du 15 avril, le conflit a éclaté. Tout ce que nous avons vu, la communauté internationale, c'est des petites trêves où ils veulent évacuer leurs ressortissants. C'est pour dire aux Soudanais, nous partons, battez-vous. Et jusqu'à là, on n'a pas pu imposer un cessez-le-feu. Le Tchad en souffre. Nous avons aujourd'hui près d'1 million de réfugiés soudanais au niveau du Tchad. Le PAM vient de déclarer que si d'ici janvier, il n'y a pas de contribution pour le PAM, ces réfugiés n'auront même pas de quoi boire ou de quoi manger. Et ça risque d'être une catastrophe humanitaire. Nous avons ouvert nos frontières. Nous les avons laissés entrer sans aucune condition. Nous avons une frontière de 1300 km avec le Soudan. Nous avons mobilisé des forces pour assurer la sécurité, justement pour éviter la migration clandestine vers l'Europe. Également pour éviter qu'il y ait des infiltrations de terroristes qui vont aller vers le Sahel. Mais la communauté internationale est autiste à ce niveau. C'est ça le minimum de droits de l'homme que nous voulons, la pertinence, la vision de ceux qui ont rédigé la déclaration est indéniable, mais sa mise en œuvre pose problème et la communauté internationale est interrogée. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Your Excellency, the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Chad, and I know that we all stand with you and are pleading for more support for the refugees that you are hosting. I would now like to invite the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Thailand, His Excellency Mr. Shihasak Pungkitka, to deliver his remarks. Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, as we witness events unfolding around the world, it seems that we're going from one crisis to another. COVID-19, Ukraine, Gaza, and in my own region, Myanmar. And then, of course, there is the threat of climate change, which looms large. I think these crises reminds us that our peace is fragile and that our security is indivisible. They also remind us of our common humanity, the overriding importance of safeguarding human rights, human dignity, and human security for all. Human rights abuses lead to conflict, and conflicts lead to human rights abuses. People are the first to suffer and are held hostage by armed hostilities. Having served as President of the Human Rights Council before, I think we in the Council needs to do better in terms of conflict prevention, conflict resolution, and peace building with the full respect for human rights at the core of our efforts. In our view, preventing human rights violation and repression must begin at home, at the national level, and that is why Thailand has spearheaded many years back the resolution in the Council on technical cooperation and capacity building, for oftentimes human rights abuses are due to the lack of national human rights infrastructure and capacity. It is perhaps a small step, but from our perspective, it goes a long way in terms of fostering a culture of respect for human rights and human dignity. Madam Chair, in spite of our best efforts, the world will never be free of conflicts. And when a crisis breaks out, we must do our best to address its humanitarian impact. In our region, we are concerned about the ongoing situation in Myanmar. To be sure, any lasting solution to the situation must come from within, be Myanmar-led and Myanmar-owned. Nonetheless, on Thailand's part, we seek to facilitate and assist in any way we can to encourage all parties concerned in Myanmar to pursue genuine dialogue and reconciliation. The Thai government is now beginning consultations with Myanmar to upscale humanitarian assistance along the common border to address the needs of the population. Beyond the importance of humanitarian assistance itself, we hope that it would provide an opening for all stakeholders to commit to working together towards a dialogue process that would advance the cause of peace and stability in Myanmar for the people of Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, and also for reminding us of the situation in Myanmar, which has left the headlines. I'd now like to give the floor to the Deputy Prime Minister of Foreign Affairs for Turkey, His Excellency, Mr. Yasim Ekrem Sarim. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Excellencies. I congratulate the Human Rights Day of the entire human family on the 75th anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations. The declaration reflects the most fundamental consensus reached by the international community on the recognition and the protection of human rights at the global level. As we gather here today to mark this meaningful day, our commitment to upholding human rights and fostering lasting peace and security has never been more critical. While the number of conflicts and the wars increase in our region across the world, we feel an increased sense of responsibility for standing against human rights violations and for establishing lasting peace and stability. At the center of this responsibility lies the urgent need to address the terrible situation in Gaza, where the pursuit of human rights and the peace faces immense challenges. Today, the ongoing human attacks in Gaza strike a major blow not only the basic rights of Palestinian people, but also the common values of all humanity. The failure to stop this human tragedy so far exposes the difference of the international community and the weaknesses of the international system. To avoid carrying this shame into the future, all countries share an obligation to act now to stop the bloodshed in Gaza and to establish lasting peace with a two-state vision. As a responsible member of the international community, Turkey will continue to work tirelessly to put an end to the injustice experienced by the Palestinian people. We will continue our humanitarian and solution-oriented initiatives on every platform. Distinguished participants, our stance against hate crimes, especially those based on racism, xenophobia and Islamophobia, which are now alarmingly on the rise in some countries, is clear and determined. Solidarity among all countries in combating hate crimes and taking concrete steps towards ensuring accountability without any excuse is of utmost importance. This is necessary for our societies to live together in the peaceful atmosphere they deserve. I would like to conclude by underlining that it is essential for all countries to take a principled and consistent stance without double standards to ensure the protection of common values and human dignity. This approach constitutes the foundation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whose 75th anniversary we are celebrating today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Excellency. That was exactly 3 minutes, too. You're the only one so far. Next, I'd like to give the floor to the Deputy Minister of Justice of South Africa, His Excellency Mr. John Jeffrey. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. The late President of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, signed the democratic South African Constitution into effect on the 10th of December 1996. He chose that day to sign the Constitution into law as the day that the UN Human Rights Declaration was adopted 40 years earlier, because he wanted to convey an important message regarding the sterling role played by the United Nations and the people of goodwill across the world in the struggle for freedom, justice and human rights in South Africa, and to show the commitment of the people of South Africa to human rights, norms, values, principles and standards enshrined in the Declaration. The Declaration inspired the decolonization struggle in the Global South and the global anti-apartheid movement. The commitment of the UN in 1945 to make sure that the atrocities of World War II never happen again was one of the driving forces behind the adoption of the Declaration. Yet here we are today, finding ourselves in a world with many areas of conflict. Conflict has increased after decades of relative decline. Direct deaths in war, numbers of displaced populations, military spending and terrorist incidents, amongst others, have all surged since the beginning of this century. Last year, the number of conflict-related deaths reached a 20-year high. South Africa is, of course, no stranger to the conflict. Our history is one of oppression and violence, human rights violations. Apartheid is a crime against humanity, discrimination and distrust amongst people. It did that particularly on the basis of dehumanizing black people, that black people were not equal to white people and therefore could be treated differently and oppressed. In fact, some of the ancestors of the Afrikaners, the Voortrekkers, as they moved through the interior of southern Africa, believed that God had given people must make way. So the problem is one of dehumanization, and I think that is one of the fundamental issues in a conflict, is that the rights, the humanity of all people involved in that conflict need to be recognized and are equal. The Nazis killed 6 million Jews in the Holocaust because they dehumanized them. They also killed Soviet prisoners of war, Polish people, Romani, disabled people, dissidents and gay and bisexual men because they dehumanized them. The only way to achieve lasting peace is through negotiations and dialogue, and that needs to take into account the roots of the conflict, the fears of the people. So we need to ensure that there's an immediate cessation of hostilities where hostilities occur, and lastly, that those responsible for war crimes, for genocide, for crimes against humanity are held to account. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And I now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Israel, Her Excellency Ms. Meirav Alon Shahar. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you. Sitting behind me today is Rachel, a mother grappling with unimaginable pain. Her only son, Hirsch Goldberg Pauling, a civilian, was attending a music festival when Hamas descended upon it on the morning of October 7th. They blew off his arm and then took him to Gaza. He's still there. It has been 67 agonizing days, and Rachel remains in the dark. One cannot speak with any credibility about peace and security in our region without demanding the immediate return of all our hostages and without condemning Hamas on the atrocities committed on October 7th. Not once, including in the statement today, has any representative from the Palestinian Authority condemned the murder, the rape, and mutilation of Israelis on that fateful morning. Can they genuinely be considered a partner in peace when time and again they have supported Hamas, defended their actions, including in the United Nations, and hailed them as an integral part of their society? I agree that the system is broken. For the past 67 days, it has favored the terrorists. It has favored those who use schools to fire rockets, who use hospitals to house its headquarters, to use the people as human shields. It has allowed those who practice massacre denial to stand on panels like today and attack my country. It has allowed someone to preach from his platform about the right to life when his leaders defend and cover up Hamas crimes. It has allowed him to stand and talk about dehumanization when members of his government call Jews humanoids and people of the evil. Terrorists are not born, they are made. The Palestinian Authority preaches peace abroad, but teaches hate at home. Generations of children are indoctrinated in its schools. The murder of Israelis has been met with cheers and applause in its streets. Year after year, the Palestinian Authority spends millions of dollars on supporting acts of terrorism through the abhorrent pay-to-slay policy. It pays monthly salaries to terrorists in prisons. It rewards them for their cold-blooded murder of innocent people. Everyone must ask, does the Palestinian Authority plan to reward those who carried out the attacks on October 7th? To bring about a more peaceful tomorrow, we must ensure both Israelis and Palestinians are able to live in peace and security. I agree that we must commit to doing things differently. One must ensure that children being taught in schools are not taught to hate. The terrorists are not rewarded. Things must be done differently. Never again will the Jewish people be massacred, and never again should those who call for their annihilation be defended and protected here at the United Nations. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights arose from the horrors of the Holocaust, a retrospective and a delayed response to a disregard for the human rights of the Jewish people. I hope that retrospectively, the world will also wake up to the barbarity of the acts on October 7th and those that are responsible. Not just those who carried out the attacks, but those who encouraged, trained, and supported them, and shielded them as well. Our determination knows no bounds. Our resolve has no limits. With the anguish of Rachel and the countless families weighing heavy on our hearts, we will do everything we can to bring back Hirsch and all the other hostages home. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I now invite the chairperson of the Constitutional Court of Kazakhstan, Her Excellency, Mrs. Elvira Azmova. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Уважаемые дамы и господа, сегодня весь мир отмечает 75 лет со дня принятия Всеобщей декларации прав человека, которая ставит во главу угла спасение грядущих поколений от бедствий войны, предотвращение конфликтов и укрепление мира. В контексте дискуссии отмечу несколько ключевых факторов обеспечения международного мира и безопасности. Во-первых, это незыблемая приверженность защите прав и фундаментальных свобод. Права человека всегда должны служить универсальным инструментом предотвращения конфликтов, разрешения споров и устойчивого мира. Во-вторых, основополагающее значение достижения экономического, социального прогресса и развития, основа доступа людей к качественным государственным услугам, борьбы с коррупцией, сдерживания злоупотребления властью и установления общественного договора имеет верховенство права. В-третьих, приверженность каждого участника международных отношений целям и принципам Устава ООН, нацеленность на мирное урегулирование споров и конфликтов. Уважаемые дамы и господа, Казахстан – это страна, всегда выступающая за мирное разрешение споров и призывающая к диалогу с искренним желанием внести свой вклад в вопросах мира и безопасности. На заре своей независимости, прислушавшись к мнению народа, моя страна добровольно отказалась от огромного ядерного арсенала и стала активным участником антиядерного движения. В ходе 54-й сессии Совета ООН по правам человека мы со своими партнерами, активными сторонниками этого движения, впервые представили совместное заявление с призывом к международному сообществу уважать неотъемлемое право на жизнь без ядерной угрозы. Казахстан, расположенный в сердце евразийского континента, в котором гармонично сплелись различные культуры и религии, очень дорожит своим миром и культурой толерантности. Мы убеждены, что их поддержание основывается на ценностях свободы человека, человеческом достоинстве и равенстве между всеми членами сообщества. В октябре текущего года Казахстан представил Совету ООН по правам человека резолюцию обеспечения качественного образования во имя мира и толерантности для каждого ребенка. Она была принята консенсусом и получила коспонсорство 126 стран. Главной целью этой инициативы является воспитание и обучение молодого поколения важности прав человека, идеям мира и толерантности. В этом ключе Казахстан поддерживает призывы Генерального секретаря ООН и Верховного комиссара по правам человека поставить во главу угла ценность человеческой жизни и достоинства, использовать преобразующую и превентивную роль прав человека в вопросах мира и безопасности.
Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Eamon Gilmore of the European Union. He's the Special Representative for Human Rights. You have the floor, Excellency.
Thank you, Under-Secretary General. Today's discussion takes place at a time when the world is convulsed by conflict, including in Europe, and with it a disregard for international law and widespread atrocious violations of human rights. We have all learned the hard way that conflict usually has its origins in the denial of human rights, and it was this realisation that led to the foundation of the European Union, which is essentially a peace and human rights project. Our treaties make clear that the Union's external action is guided by the principles of democracy, rule of law and the universality and indivisibility of human rights. And this is because history has taught us that we can only really protect our own freedom if we protect the freedom of others. Our High Representative Joseph Borrell said recently, "One horror can never justify another." Nothing can ever justify the killing of innocent civilians, particularly children. The same standards of human rights and the same international humanitarian law applies everywhere. The suffering of others is no different, whether it occurs in Ukraine, Gaza, Israel, Ethiopia, Sudan, Myanmar, or the many other places in the world where conflict is happening. Prevention, peace building, reconciliation and mediation are an important part of the EU's action plan on human rights and democracy. And I want to say a couple of things about what the European Union does to link human rights with peace and security. Conflict prevention is a central part of the EU's external action and the common security and defence policy and crisis response. Human rights are prioritised in the EU's early action and conflict prevention tools, including the EU Conflict Early Warning System, Conflict Analysis, Horizon Scanning and the EU Atrocity Prevention Toolkit. The EU's flagship prevention tool, the Early Warning System, considers factors that indicate risks of serious violations, including hate speech, a country's history with mass atrocities or failed recognition of past abuses. Human rights mainstreaming is a standard practice in our CSDP missions and operations, and we have deployed human rights advisors in many missions to facilitate this work. The EU supports the security and defence sectors of partner countries to strengthen their capacities to protect against various types of threats and to respond more efficiently to the security needs of individuals and the state. Last week, EU member states endorsed the EU human rights and international humanitarian law due diligence policy on security sector support to third parties. The EU is very committed to transitional justice as an integral part of state and peace building and embedded in our wider crisis response, conflict prevention, security and development efforts. Accountability is crucial, not only to ensure justice, especially for victims, but also to prevent future violations and abuses. Colombia, I think, is a very good example of this, which the European Union supports. And I was glad to hear Vice President Francia Marquez speak earlier and encouraging us to learn the lessons from that process. And one of those lessons clearly is that the route to defeating terrorism can never be over the dead bodies of civilians and of children. Finally, this Council, the EU human rights mechanisms and the work of the Office of the High Commissioner are all vital for our efforts to achieve peace and security for all, and we should all support them and we should all cooperate with them. I agree that we need to do many things differently, but there are also many things that we can already do, and we should do those more effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gilmore. I would now like to give the floor to Ms. Isha Difan, Chairperson of the Coordination Committee of Special Procedures. Ms. Difan will be delivering remarks on behalf of all special procedures of the Human Rights Council. Ms. Difan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Special procedures are often characterized as the eyes and ears of the Human Rights Council and the United Nations. It is high time to translate these words into reality. Recent years and months have been deeply marked by conflicts and crises. We cannot but think, what if human rights would have been more central? What if people and decision makers would have listened to our early warning calls? Because special procedures have been at the forefront of the international responses to emerging crises, putting human rights as a concrete response to and preventive tool to these crises. However, what is happening today shows that we can and should do better. The UN should consider us as a valuable resource before, during, and after these kinds of crises erupt, and involve us when considering possible actions. This potential should be developed in a more systematic manner. Special procedures have a multifaceted relevance to prevention and peace and security. Madam Chair, I could give you a list of that, but I would rather, in the interest of time, refer you to a recent study just issued by Quaker United Nations in cooperation with the UN Office and several mandate holders, demonstrating how this prevention potential and the positive impact of special procedures action in relation to peace and security and sustainable peace and security has been developed over time. But the prevention role of special procedures cannot occur in isolation, Madam. It needs partnerships and cooperation with all concerned at the United Nations and at the country level to bear fruit. The UN and states should maximize the use of multi-layer networks composed of special procedures and with other human rights mechanisms, which generate a rich set of practical and solution-oriented recommendations to prevent conflicts and ensure lasting peace. We therefore support the idea of a consolidated system of tracking relevant recommendations from human rights systems that could identify early signs of crisis, but also provide assistance to states in dealing with the aftermath of crisis. Madam Chair, special procedures should also be part of what the UN can offer states that are asking for assistance. They can be part of the solution and, for example, go to countries and provide advice to states facing a situation that may degenerate into conflict or unrest, or at the aftermath of the conflict. While we admit that progress has been made in recent years, special procedures should have better access to other UN bodies such as the Security Council or the Peace-Building Commission, as a concrete way of embedding human rights in prevention and peace building. In conclusion, Madam Chair, our common agenda clearly calls for a better use of special procedure outputs within the UN system to address challenges and bring them closer to other processes to maximize their impact and assist state parties with compliance. The Summit for the Future will therefore be a real opportunity to materialize this call. I thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ms. Difan. We have 3 more speakers, and of course we're way over time. We were supposed to have a 3rd segment after that. We will not be able to do a whole 3rd segment, but we will ask our chair to do a few concluding remarks, and apologies that we will be a little bit over time. Thanks to our remaining 3 speakers in advance for sticking to your 3 minutes. So I'd like to invite Mr. Pablo de Graef, academic and former UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparation and guarantees of non-recurrence to deliver his intervention.
Thank you. Madam Chair, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to make 3 points about human rights, peace and security. First, even in the domain most closely associated with the peace and security pillar of the UN, namely conflict, human rights, it is sad to need the reminder, still need to be respected, not only to avoid excesses of the sort we are witnessing at present, but also because there is good empirical evidence that human rights violations are a driver of conflict, and that by contrast, peace agreements with strong human rights components are more stable than others, as Adam Day and I document in a paper written as an input for this roundtable and a similar meeting held recently in New York. My main interest here, however, lies in my second point. This anniversary of the Universal Declaration should be an occasion to recall that human rights are not merely redress mechanisms, means of reaction exposed to violations, but rather that functionally rights were mainly conceived as protective measures to avoid ex ante certain harms. The way in which human rights resolve problems before they arise, embody general interests, enhance security, promote trust in state institutions, and actually enable certain forms of community is frequently ignored. Third, this conception of human rights as preventive mechanisms, underlying reports I presented to this body in my previous roles, and more importantly, the conception that also underlies the Secretary General's brief on the new agenda for peace, can address some of the criticisms about prevention work. It is true that discussions about prevention heretofore have taken place largely in the context of crisis prevention, and that despite recommendations to this end, the UN still has not articulated a broad and upstreamed prevention policy. As important as crisis prevention is, however, this lens overemphasizes the role of international actors, thereby raising concerns about national sovereignty. Furthermore, the prioritization of emergency interventions sidelines issues that are relevant for prevention and about which significant expertise has been accumulated at the national level, but which usually fall outside the time span of crisis prevention. Thus, to finalize and to connect the 2 points, a more problem-solving conception of human rights helps to de-dramatize discussions about prevention and helps to focus on the broader, more systematic, more long-term work that builds state and governance institutions, strengthens civil society and social cohesion, all of which is necessary in order to give prevention a real chance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. de Graaf. And finally, I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Itonde Kakoma, President of Interpeace, an important organization focusing on peace building.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Madam Chair, I take the directive to respond to the panel before as you guided us. And in doing so, I refer back to the remarks of Her Excellency, the Minister of Justice and Public Security of Haiti, in which she stated so clearly that not respecting human rights threatens peace and thus security. Madam Chair, in this very clear statement, Her Excellency, the Minister of Justice and Public Security of Haiti, has summarized our 30-year experience as an international organization for peace building, which I am now privileged to lead. And further to this, I can say unequivocally that any peace process, any peace and security intervention that is not rooted in human dignity will be short-lived. Further to this, and per the opening framing, Madam Undersecretary General, you gave a very stark description of the state of our world, where a quarter of our world lives in a situation of conflict or crisis, if I heard you correctly. And here I think it's important for us to state very plainly that from the perspective of interpeace, peace is not merely the absence of violence. It is also the presence of those factors that create an enabling environment for communities to thrive and create the futures they want in dignity. And here, dignity, and specifically in the aftermath of crises and conflict. We were born 30 years ago for a reason. The world was facing gross violations against humanity, and we were asked to consider improving, I quote, international assistance in war-torn societies. And here the restoration of dignity is deeply rooted in upholding these fundamental human rights, and in doing so addressing past crimes and abuses. But we know the intersection between human rights and peace is not solely about redress. It is precisely, as my distinguished colleague indicated, about prevention. Because in putting forward human rights, it lays the very foundation we describe in envisioning alternatives to violence. Now, here you ask the question, and I conclude, what about the future? In order to envision the future, we must deal with the past, and we know that increasingly, both leaders and communities struggling to move beyond conflict are blinded by the inability to see beyond conflict, precisely because of mental health and psychosocial support challenges. And so as much as we look to the future in this respect, it is deeply tied to the upholding of the right to health, and therein mental health and psychosocial support, in order for future generations to benefit from peace and stability. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you for ending this segment with such an emphasis on the importance of human dignity for peace and for enabling environment to create futures of peace. Thank you very much. I'm now going to wrap up by giving the floor to the chair, Her Excellency, Ms. Francia Marquez Mina, Vice President of Colombia, who will wrap up this discussion. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Quiero resumir lo que hemos escuchado hoy acá y el consenso que emerge en nuestros intercambios. El paradigma y el sistema de derechos humanos nos ha quedado corto porque hoy no somos capaces de detener el genocidio, el desplazamiento forzado, las violencias contra la vida. Si no podemos proteger la vida de los niños y niñas en el conflicto y agresiones, nuestro sistema está roto, como lo dijo el ministro de Palestina. Hemos escuchado un consenso sobre la necesidad de proteger la vida nuestra y la vida en el planeta, de proteger a los civiles víctimas de los conflictos, por encima de los poderes, de los privilegios, por encima de los intereses violentos y limitados de los estados, por encima de las agendas de la exclusión. Un mensaje claro: no podemos sacrificar los derechos humanos bajo la excusa de la seguridad. No podemos castigar a las poblaciones civiles por los actos terroristas que cometen algunas personas. La vida es sagrada y hay que respetarla sea de donde sea y venga de donde venga. Primero, nuestra común humanidad. Ningún Estado está por encima de los derechos humanos. Debemos trabajar contra las desigualdades, resistir todo intento de imponer modelos violentos y excluyentes. Debemos reconocer las injusticias históricas sobre las que hemos construido nuestras sociedades. La deshumanización de la que hablaba el ministro de Sudáfrica. Debemos reconocer estas injusticias para poder reforzar nuestra común humanidad e imaginar nuevas sociedades justas, equitativas, nuevas economías que se ponen al servicio de la vida y no al servicio de la muerte. Y los caminos que tenemos que juntos trasegar para ello. Como dijo la ministra de Indonesia, debemos acabar con los ciclos de violencia. Debemos atender las causas estructurales de los conflictos en nuestros modelos económicos excluyentes y violentos, modelos colonialistas, reconocer que los derechos humanos son individuales, pero también son colectivos, como lo dijo el presidente de Senegal. Debemos proteger nuestras libertades, pero también combatir el hambre, la pobreza, la desigualdad. Creo que existe un consenso de que debemos poner la protección de la vida en el centro, incluyendo la vida de la naturaleza, y por eso debemos luchar juntos para enfrentar el cambio climático. Para ello, la justicia climática y la protección de nuestro planeta es clave para la garantía de la paz y la seguridad en el mundo. También debemos luchar contra la impunidad de quienes atentan contra nuestra vida común de la humanidad y reforzar el consenso internacional por la protección de los derechos en la diversidad, rechazando el racismo estructural y la discriminación. El que no podamos frenar la muerte no significa que la aceptamos. Acá estamos escuchándonos, construyendo juntos y buscando posibilidades que permitan resolver el conflicto o los conflictos. Debemos dar un paso para adelante como gobernantes, como civiles, como defensores de derechos humanos y resistir a las violencias armadas y estructurales que afectan a nuestras naciones, que afectan a todo el mundo. Todos los Estados miembros nos comprometimos a asumir la responsabilidad de garantizar los derechos humanos. Necesitamos que esa palabra empeñada por nuestras naciones, por nuestros países, se cumpla y así podamos construir un mejor planeta. Es necesario reafirmar la necesidad de poner el diálogo y la reconciliación en el centro. Solo a través del diálogo podemos avanzar en la construcción de la paz. Si cada quien se queda en su esquina con su postura y su única verdad, no vamos a lograr resolver los conflictos que hoy tenemos en el planeta. Debemos disponernos como seres humanos para construir. Y yo llamo a las mujeres que hacen parte de las Naciones Unidas y a las mujeres del mundo. Nosotras tenemos que poner nuestro instinto del cuidado y nuestro amor maternal, no para seguir impulsando la muerte, Ese amor que sentimos por nuestros hijos, por nuestras hijas, tenemos que ponerlo al servicio de la vida. Yo no me imagino lo que están sufriendo las mamás de Israel, que por supuesto han perdido a sus hijos, pero tampoco me imagino lo que están sufriendo las mamás de Palestina, que todos los días están enterrando a sus hijos asesinados. Esta barbarie tiene que pasar, tiene que parar. Para eso se crearon las Naciones Unidas y tenemos que asumir nuestra responsabilidad como estados por el bien de nuestras naciones y por el bien del mundo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Excellency, for that excellent and powerful summary on the central thread of our shared humanity and how we can recast our humanity in the service of life. We've now come to the end of our discussion. We've had to cut it short a bit. Apologies that you weren't able to come back in the interest of time. Thanks to all of our speakers. Thanks also to our audience. And I now give the floor back to Peter.
Many thanks, UN Under-Secretary General for the Department of Global Communications, Melissa Fleming, and of course to your panelists, very reflective issues that you have spoken about, and I'm sure many of us here will be taking away a lot of information from what you have told us. We thank you very much. I also want to thank the audience for your patience. We'll be breaking off for lunch now. But we shall reconvene in this hall for one panel and in room 19 for another panel at 3 o'clock. So we reconvene for lunch now and we're back at 3 o'clock. Thank you very much.